I want to just begin with a few comments, and then I'm going to read my paper. I've discovered over the years that I'm way better in print than I am in person. People will often ask to come and meet me, and I always say that's a very bad idea. It's much better to just stick with the books. So I'm going to read. I'm going to read to you. I want to begin with gratitude to a whole bunch of people whose names I know. I'm going to miss a few, but Sandra, Jesse, Raquel, Bernd, Michael, and Dominic, thank you for, I don't know who made the mistake of inviting me, but thank you for inviting me, okay? I also want to apologize for my English. I know this is a German audience. I should be speaking in German. My ancestors were in fact German on my mother's side. Wiedel is their name, but they migrated in the 1850s, and we don't speak German anymore, so I apologize for that. I also want to issue my own jealousy. I want 4.6 million euros. I want to start a center like this. I think what you're doing here is marvelous. I'll talk a bit about what we're trying to do at Rice. We have something called the GEM program. GEM stands for Gnosticism, Esotericism, and Mysticism. We have 7 faculty who work in this area, but we don't have anyone after that. No postdocs, no fellows, but we do have seven faculty, and we're very, very serious about this margins at the center approach. And finally, I was joking with Rainer before my talk. You know, he asked what the hell is going on here. I told him it's about to get way worse with this talk. We're going to kind of go down the rabbit hole. So please go down with me, and please laugh at my jokes. They are jokes. Even if they're not funny, just laugh. Just make me feel better. All right. So here we go. So you're already laughing. That's good. I want to begin with a story from American anthropology, a scene from Zora Neale Hurston's memoir, Dust Tracks on the Road, which was published in 1941. Hurston was a student of Franz Boas at Barnard College in New York City. She engaged in ethnographic work in Haiti and Jamaica, and she was a major voice in the Harlem Renaissance. I make no claims to having read Hurston or of being a historian of anthropology. I recently encountered this scene in a dissertation by a young intellectual named Sam Stolce, which was on the practice of channeling, the book Black Elk Speaks, and settler colonialism that I read for my home university. I was very struck by this story, and I want to begin with it. I want to begin with this story because it asks a question that I most want to ask this evening. Namely, what do we do or not do with the empirical or physical, really space-time implications of precognitive phenomena, which I have long thought of as the most well-documented and philosophically important of all anomalous phenomena. If we are looking for what you are calling alternative rationalities, precognition is a most obvious candidate. And I'm well aware that it goes under different names and different practices all over the world, usually some called divination or divinatory or mantic practices. But I see these, as you'll see as we get going here, I'm much more interested in the experience of precognition than the practices that are wrapped around this experience. Hurston's chapter is entitled The Inside Search. It is probably sometime in the 1890s. Hurston is a young girl, probably around 7 years of age. She is on the porch of a neighbor. This is her now. I sat down, and soon I was asleep in a strange way. Like clear-cut stereopticon slides, I saw 12 scenes flash before me, each one held until I had seen it well in every detail, and then be replaced by another. There was no continuity, as in an average dream, just disconnected scene after scene with blank spaces in between. I knew that they were all true, a preview of things to come. So when I left the porch, I left a great deal behind me. I was weighed down with the power I did not want. I had knowledge before its time. These detailed images of future history would return to Hurston repeatedly. She kept quiet about them, but she knew perfectly well that she was not like everyone else. Secrecy was a kind of social protection. Quote, I never told anyone around me about these strange things. It was too different, unquote. Hurston does not let her readers escape into easy explanations about this time-traveling difference. I quote, time was to prove the truth of my visions, for one by one they came to pass. As soon as one was fulfilled, it ceased to come, unquote. Zora Neale Hurston was being led. Hurston does something very interesting with this alternative rationality. She locates it in professional writers. In her case, the New York City newspaper columnist O.O. McIntyre and the British author Rudyard Kipling. But we could name many others here, including Mark Twain, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Mary Shelley, J.R.R. Tolkien, Franz Kafka, Virginia Woolf, Stanislav Lem, and Philip K. Dick, to name just a few. Precognition and literary creativity, it turns out, are often deeply intertwined. Hurston takes great comfort in this. She reads McIntyre and Kipling as what she calls fellow pilgrims. She is not alone. Hurston also asserts a kind of spiritual elitism or esoteric hermeneutic. There are certain human capacities, like precognition, that most readers will never know, can never know. Not because this is a piece of data that they could be told, but because they would not believe such a thing even if they were told. Why? Because they do not know this ability. It is not them, but it is Zora Neale Hurston. She has ears to hear, as the first century Jewish rabbi said. But the public, the millions as she calls them, do not have a clue and never will. I see few, if any, conventional interpretive options here. The 12 historical scenes seen years before they happened are not presented as some rhetorical device for the sake of the memoir. They cannot be adequately treated as hallucinations, misremembered exaggerations, cultural representations, discursive strategies, or any other at arm's length category that we want to invoke to salvage our own sense of reality. They simply happened. As such, they challenge us to rethink not only what a human being is, but the very nature of space and time, and weirder still, the relationship of this physical space-time to the states of consciousness itself. The 3 bars. I'm going to give you a little section titles here to keep the talk rolling quickly. Let me put it this way. With a figure like Hurston, we are confronted with 3 basic questions, 3 bars to get over as we consider the matters and minds at hand. The first question is simply, do these anomalous experiences happen at all? And I think the answer of a lot of secular, scientifically trained people is no. Okay? But they do. The second question is, if these anomalous experiences happen, can they tell us something about the nature of consciousness or mind? Again, I think if you think they happen, you can probably get over this bar as well. The third bar, though, is the tough one, and it's where I want to push the audience a bit. Can these experiences tell us something about the nature of nature, that is, of space, time, and matter? If you want to translate this, should the scientists be interested in these experiences? I think so. I think they tell us something about the physical world. Allow me first, though, to get at these three questions in a roundabout way. This, by the way, is a magazine piece. It's an interview I did with my own university about a year ago to look forward to a conference we were hosting last March by a young woman named Kendall Christ, who, by the way, was desperate to write this article because her grandfather had seen numerous UFOs as an Air Force pilot and had essentially gone to his death talking about these encounters. And so Kendall was really keen to do this piece. Allow me to tell you the story of how I came to host our Archives of the Impossible at Rice University. Allow me also to be what I happen to be, an academic, a professor, a historian of religions, a nerd who loves books, strange words, and even stranger people. I do so not to be jargony or opaque or trendy. I do so to advance our conversation. I actually think the humanities possess immense resources for precisely this. What we have come to think of as the humanities, after all, is that our assumed sensibilities around the nature of mind, self and society, secularism and science are all socially and historically constructed. They are not innocent, natural, or universal. Even the conditioned sensorium of the body-brain, what we experience to be true with our senses and our thoughts, are here informed by centuries of affirmations and denials, religious fights, and too many colonial, imperial, and racist projects to name. We are who we are because of what our ancestors did and did not do, because of who won and who lost, because of who killed whom. And yet there is a bright flip side to this humanist vision. None of this is permanent, natural, or necessary. It is all constructed. And so reality is always punching holes in our historical and social constructions, including in those ancestors who won the wars. Much of this hole punching, it turns out, displays fantastic correspondences, even identities, between the human being and the larger environment. We begin to suspect that our quick and common divisions between the inside and the outside, between the subject and the object, and everything that this split produces in our minds may not finally be the case. We cannot hear this possibility because these social constructions enacted over centuries and in multiple cultural zones have been incredibly effective. They created the most intimate subjectivities, the negotiations, compromises, dreams, fears, bigotries, and paradoxes that are us. They have also been devastatingly myopic. This repression, after all, renders us basically inept, incapable of understanding, much less accepting, common human experiences that violate our socially assumed splits between consciousness and cosmos, between mind and matter. We think these events are impossible, but they are only impossible within our historically constructed frameworks. Put most simply, our conclusions are a function of our exclusions. Okay? This is what I tell my scientific friends all the time. They say, well, we can explain everything. I'm like, sure you can. You just took off the table everything you can explain. Right? So, and I think we do the same in the humanities. I think we just look the other way when something happens we can't explain with our categories. Brave new words. In 2010, I published an intellectual history of a most abused word, the paranormal. Michael referred to this book. Where's Michael? Michael. The book was authors of the impossible. The philosophical associations and scientific nuances of the paranormal, first coined in French in 1903, by the way, as the paranormal, were complex and subtle. The word signaled something entirely natural, but well beyond our present science, something supernatural. 2 words now, supernatural. The technical term, please note, did not come to be in the tabloids, but in some of the most elite intellectuals and academic locations on the planet. Institutions like Cambridge, Stanford, Harvard, Duke, Princeton, and the University of Virginia all spawned research programs where these phenomena were variously called different things. They were called psychical, first by the British chemist and physicist Sir William Crookes in 1875. They were called spiritual or superhuman by Alfred Russel Wallace in 1876. Wallace was the co-discoverer of what became evolutionary biology. They were called superhuman by Friedrich Nietzsche between 1881 and 1889 through his famous teaching of the Übermensch, or the Superman. They were called supernormal by the Cambridge-trained classicist Frederick Myers. They were called superhuman again by William James at Harvard in 1909, and a bit later they came to be called parapsychological by 2 University of Chicago-trained botanists, J.B. and Louisa Ryan at Duke. The word was earlier coined by a German writer named Max de Soir in the 1880s, by the way. The newly invented words just kept coming and coming and coming. It was as if the scientists and intellectuals wanted to name something that could not be named. The same continues today, of course, and so here we are. I have tried my own hand at this. By an author of the impossible, I mean an author who writes about common human experiences that are not supposed to happen, but do anyway. And who, by writing and theorizing about these so-called impossible things, renders them newly plausible, imaginable, thinkable, in a word, real. I mean an author who makes the impossible possible. I featured 4 such authors in the book. One was Jacques Vallée, a French-born American astronomer, computer scientist, and investor in advanced biomedical technology, who has written numerous acclaimed books about the UFO phenomenon. Jacques was also the basis for the French scientist in Steven Spielberg's film Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Came out in 1977, a film on whose set Jacques served as a consultant. Sometime in the early winter of 2014, I was with Jacques in Berkeley, California, when he asked me a question. He was beginning to worry about his correspondence and research files, and he wanted to know if I had any suggestions about a university that might preserve them. I went back to my own university and asked if we could do it. Turns out we could. A long conversation and other visits to San Francisco came to a conclusion when Jacques visited Rice in March of 2016 and agreed to a major gift. I then approached another key figure in the UFO literary world with the same possibility, Whitley Strieber. Whitley is a horror and science fiction writer who also wrote what is without doubt the finest autobiographical abduction account of the 20th century, a book called Communion, which came out in 1987. Whitley also happens to be a Texan, having grown up in San Antonio. Whitley responded enthusiastically and donated about 5,000 letters he had received from individuals who recognized their own contact experience in his own. Actually, what happened was he made the mistake of putting his address in the back of the book. Don't do that. Bad mistake. The book hit the New York Times bestsellers list, and they got 250,000 letters. And it was Ann Strieber who read through the 250,000 letters and crystallized them down to the 5,000 we now have in the archive. Then came Edwin May. Ed was the nuclear physicist who led the U.S. government's classified remote viewing or psychic espionage program from 1985 to 1995. The project was founded in 1972 by two other physicists, Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff. At one point called Project Stargate, this was a serious enterprise, and by the way, very much a practice in your terms, that was well funded by government agencies for over 2 decades, mostly because, as May has repeatedly argued, the remote viewers consistently obtained empirical results that were impossible to deny. The intellectual gravitas of the gifts of Vallée, Strieber, and May created a kind of black hole. Soon others were attracted by their gravitational pull and approached us with their own offers of generosity. These now include scientific studies of unexplained aerial phenomena, scientists by the name of Richard Haynes, the history of the UFO in the US and Europe, a Pentagon worker named Larry Bryant, and the Italian-American journalist Paola Harris Leopizzi, the history and practice of physical mediumship from a British medium named Stuart Alexander, the interactions of anthropology and parapsychology from a man named Stanley Krippner, and collections of popular culture and the paranormal from the writer and scholar of religion Eric Davis. The overall sum of this growing collection must number into 1 million or so documents, letters, books, films, and recordings by now. And no, we have not archived it all, but it's there. And the sum is greater than the individual parts. The project as a whole is based on the working hypothesis that it is all connected. From the UFO and the NDE, through the poltergeist, the medium, and the afterlife, to the angel, the alien, the precognitive dream, the telepathic communication, and the abduction event. That is, after all, why all of this material sits in the same archival collection. Collecting is connecting. Collection is connection. It may not be all connected, of course, and it is indeed difficult to separate the endless weaves and webs of physical events and actual experiences, intentional fakery, fraud, and disinformation, psychopathology, and traumatic inrush. Still, serious researchers conclude often that much of it is indeed connected. I agree with the psychologist Etzel Cardania, who has done so much to classify and understand these anomalies, that the comparative study of altered states of consciousness, or ASC, upon which these impossible phenomena clearly rely, is at an early stage of research and analysis, mostly because our academic cultures simply have not tried. Obviously, you're an exception here. I quote Etzel, "The study of altered states of consciousness currently is at a similar stage to where botany was before Linnaeus proposed his taxonomy, namely a collection of interesting observations lacking enough organization and integration to make theoretical and empirical sense of them." So we're not even at Linnaeus. We're somewhere back there, much less to Darwin or genetics or DNA or wherever we are now with genetic anthropology. Such ignorance and neglect do not have to be so. As Cardania points out, such altered states were central to many of the movements that formed the modern humanities. In other words, this is us too. This isn't just about them. This is about humanists. Humanists are weird too, in case you haven't noticed. This indeed is a psychohistorical process I have also pursued in numerous books, including in my most recent book, The Superhumanities, which essentially makes this case. We could here explore Renaissance magic and mystical thought, German idealism, the Romantic movement of poetry and vision, the fusion of the occult novel and esoteric practice, the relationship between the origins of anthropology and spiritualism, or the surrealist movement of automatic writing, symbol, and trance. Or we could discuss films like Stanley Kubrick's 2001, A Space Odyssey, which clearly is based on Nietzsche's evolving superhumans. or more recently, Denis Villeneuve's Arrival, 2016, which privileges again, much like Nietzsche, a circular view of temporality and the subsequent importance of precognition. Indeed, a discussion of the impossible in modern television and film could go on for many days. The impossible is right in front of our eyes then. We are literally watching it. We are streaming it. But we are also siloing it into entertainment and fantasy. We are following in the footsteps of our ancestors, expressing our own supernatures while affirming a very specific form of rationality. We are defining what nature gets to do, of course, all the while saying that it isn't doing what it is obviously doing. To use an American political metaphor, I don't know if this works in Germany. I hope it doesn't work in Germany, but it works in the States. We are gerrymandering reality to fit the flat materialist science and local academic models of the human. Do you all know what gerrymandering is? No? Yes? It's when you carve up the electoral map so that your party wins. I think that's essentially what's going on here with this material. To invoke an astronomical metaphor, the stars cannot be seen at the brightness of midday. They are completely invisible. If we only had noon in which to see, none of us would believe that we are in fact floating in a sea of stars. The midday sun here is rational consciousness and its commitment to the senses. Midnight stands in for the altered states of consciousness in which the impossible so often appears. One state occludes the other. They are both perfectly so, but not at the same time. We think we are just the midday rational egos. As such, we ignore and demean alternative forms of rationality that are us as well. This is why I think one quickly becomes baffled, befuddled, and bedazzled in the archives of the impossible. Basically, we are approaching midnight at noon. That worked, that phrase worked. All right. Waking up inside a story. Somehow I skipped the tyranny of clarity. Oh, I did. I skipped the paragraph there. Let me just say a word about the tyranny of clarity. I think this is a real problem. I think to the extent we try to explain impossible phenomena with the categories of enlightenment reason, we miss it. We erase it. And this is why they don't show up in a scientific laboratory. If you want the impossible to go away, just put it in a scientific laboratory. It'll go away, okay? It's like going to the North Pole to look for zebras. Guess what? You're not going to find zebras at the North Pole. You got to go to where zebras live. And I'll explain in a moment where they live. Waking up inside a story now. This is where I become the humanist. Let us be aware then that such a project of comparing strange things and arriving at even stranger conclusions is neither innocent nor neutral. In academic speak, we are working toward a new critical theory that is neither modern nor postmodern, neither posthuman nor transhuman. This is neither anthropology nor religious studies as conventionally constructed along rational or frankly historical lines. It is something else, and it comes at a cost. As the anthropologist Hussein Ali Agrama has reminded us, the secular assumptions of the academy are simply not adequate to the high strangeness of the phenomenon. Nor are the two certain epistemes of what we have come to call science and religion. Neither really work very well here. Both need to be left behind, dropped, as Hussein would say, like the too heavy gear of the California firefighters who need to escape a raging fire, but cannot if they will not drop their firefighting gear. The metaphor here is Hussein likes to talk about this news story from California that firefighters were dying at an extraordinary rate, and they didn't know why. And it turned out they were dying because they wouldn't drop their gear. They were trying to save their gear, and so they couldn't run fast enough, essentially. So they had to drop their gear to save their lives. And this becomes then Hussein's point to us as academics is drop your gear. Drop your reason, drop your belief. It's not going to work here. We got to do something else. If I had to crystallize these archives down to a single soundbite, and I recognize this is not a soundbite, this is a long sentence, I would say this. Impossible phenomena, especially of a spontaneous or traumatic nature, that's a really important point here. I don't study practices. I study car accidents and heart attacks and people getting struck by lightning, these sort of traumatic events that happen often. These phenomena constitute an awakening inside a story, an early and usually coded awareness that we are being written and in ways that we may well want to write anew. The challenge is that this awakening is seldom, if ever, pure. Meaning is expressed in symbol, synchronicity, and dream, or it is displaced in time or agency. We fear ourselves. We will not own our vastness. Basically, we tell ourselves a story, and we come to think that we are that story. Okay? And I don't care what your story is. It might be a religious story, it might be a secular story. It's a story, and we don't own it as such. But we are not that story. We are telling that story, and so we are also standing outside the story. In the study of religion, we call these stories myths, by which we do not mean untruths or falsehoods, but rather stories so foundational that the people telling them or living them, being them, assume that this is the way things really are. But they never are. It all works well enough for a while and for some, but only for a while and only for some. And so the myths change, as they are changing today. Consider the UFO phenomenon. I like to joke that there are only two things you have to understand to grasp the UFO: radar and revelation. No one ever laughs at my joke, ever. Probably because it grates too much against our assumptions about the world and ourselves. But the joke is true. Engineering, astronomy, biology, medicine, neuroscience, and physics are as important here as the history of religions, anthropology, philosophy, art, and literary criticism. I have spoken about the UFO to historians, theologians, and literary critics at Harvard, Duke, and Stanford, but I have also spoken to propulsion engineers and federal funding agencies at MIT and sat with neuroscientists, biologists, statisticians, computer scientists, and quantum physicists on advisory boards in Europe and the US. In truth, to study the impossible is to study everything. It does not honor our orders of knowledge. But how? How do we step back from our respective orders of knowledge, take in all the pixels that appear to us, squint a bit perhaps, and finally make a picture pop? Many of us are frankly in denial. We have no idea what to do with the most obvious fact of our existence that does not seem to be physical at all: consciousness itself. You would think the humanities might have something to say to this question. What I have called the humanist secret above certainly suggests as much. But alas, such a secret appears to remain a secret, and the humanities have, as a result, added immeasurably to the crisis. They have, in effect, locked themselves down into what we might recognize as a nearly complete historicism, localism, contextualism, and constructivism. Society, which is to say the socially constructed, is the source and end of all human activity. We are chained to the cave floor of the senses and conventional forms of rationalism now, by our own self-made chains no less. If we speak of alternative forms of rationality or consciousness, we generally do so to reduce them explain them away by other more conventional rationalities. It is all about society, or history, or the brain, or evolutionary needs, or whatever happens to be the reigning rationality. As a direct consequence, we have no way of accepting, much less understanding, the reality of events that are very, very physical and yet clearly violate our present understanding of space, time, matter, and mind. I am thinking of dreams that are obviously precognitive of the events of the next day or decades. I began with such a dream. Encounters with dead husbands telling their wives where to find the body. Again, the literature is filled with this. And it turns out the body is really where the dead husbands tell their wives. After they apologize, by the way. Husbands are always apologizing to their wives. If you're a husband, you understand. But apparently even dead husbands do this. Humanoids emerging out of nowhere. This is just a photograph from our archives, where it's filled with humanoids and cryptids of various kinds that people are reporting in their visions. Implants in noses, ears, and legs. I've heard all of these stories. Super-sexualized abductions, stalled tractors and cars. UFOs often shut down electronic equipment in a very physical way. And military radar returns in the sky. None of this makes the least bit of sense in our present order of knowledge, so to preserve that order of knowledge, we simply deny it all in a kind of gigantic intellectual and spiritual cop-out. The situation might seem dire at the moment. Here's another picture, just one of the letters drawing an account of such an experience, and a piece of popular culture there, obviously linking the UFO to evolution, which is often done. The situation might seem dire at the moment, but it also seems to be shifting, moving, even occasionally flipping. There is real reason for hope here. The New York Times articles that Leslie Kean, Ralph Blumenthal, and Helene Cooper have written since December of 2017 have frankly been game-changing, at least in the U.S. These completely changed the conversation. But who really puts these UFO admissions together with Leslie's equally sophisticated work on the survival of bodily death? Who puts the UFO and the NDE together? Can we connect those dots? I think we can begin by admitting what we do not know and cannot know with our present ways of knowing. That is how we might come to terms with what the late Harvard psychiatrist John Mack called ontological shock. That is, this disturbing conviction that one has encountered something more real than this reality that fits no available spiritual, social, psychological, or scientific model. Okay? It is precisely this ontological shock that the experiencer most remembers, most identifies as the actual meaning of the event. If you remember nothing else about my talk this evening, please remember this. If we are going to engage the meaning of impossible phenomena, we must begin there, with how such events call into question everyone's story, everyone's ontological convictions, including and especially our own. I think we struggle to do this because we lack an adequate theory of the imagination. Actually, I happen to think that this is the number one reason we remain baffled. I know from long experience that listeners will likely misunderstand me at this point. So let me explain. By invoking the imagination, I do not mean to suggest that something like the UFO encounters or psychedelic experiences on psilocybin are simply imagined. I do not mean to argue that technological craft, conscious energies, unions with the cosmos, or invisible entities are not involved, are not in the bedroom or forest. Much less do I mean to refer to the ordinary states of fantasy, daydreaming, or dreaming. I mean to suggest rather that the traumatic or psychedelic event has let the presence in, has opened up the human organism in real and effective ways, whatever or whoever it is. And it may well be many things or beings, including the experiencer. I also mean to suggest that these presences are interacting with the human organism in and through that organism's imagination. The imagination is the privileged organ of contact, communication, and communion. Egoic rationality is simply not adequate. Language and grammar are mediums, not the mediated. The senses are not reliable. They evolve for more practical and adaptive reasons. If you want to say something like, well, I won't believe it until I see it, then you are making a cardinal mistake that the neuroscience of perception warns us strongly against. You are being duped. By invoking the imagination, then, I intend to refer to something very specific, especially rare, palpably felt, often literally electric or electromagnetic, altered states of mind and body that result in virtual reality displays that the person in question does not consciously construct or create. Okay, that's really important. The person does not do this. I mean a kind of unconscious movie making that just goes off in the seer. The person does not imagine such things. The person is shown such things. Hence the revelation of my failed joke. But the imagination also shows every sign of being capable of affecting physical objects and events, even the very workings of space and time, often towards some symbolic meaning. Think scenes of a life that have not yet been lived. Think flying or falling objects in poltergeist events, symbolically signaling anxiety, anger, or unexplained trauma. Okay? Pans fly, curtains burst into flames, bodies are scratched, very physical things happen. These are not just imagined events. Think marks on the body of the visionary in the Christian stigmata or the modern UFO implant. Again, very physical events that are clearly related to the religious imagination, or in this case, the UFO imagination. Think communally witness alterations of gravity like floating or levitating saints, Victorian mediums, or demon-possessed persons. Think banal physical objects, flowers and honeypots appearing out of nowhere or teleporting across the room. It simply no longer makes any sense to separate mind and matter in these experiences or events. It is simply is not so. All right, I'm going to end with one final example here. So this takes it back home. This takes it right back to the academy, I hope. I was lecturing, and by the way, secrecy is involved here because this woman did not want me to share her name or her university. So you can see how secrecy is, again, a kind of social protection. It's a real thing. It's not just a strategy to acquire some kind of power or authority. I was lecturing like this at a major university about a decade ago. Afterwards, as usually happens, really as always happens, a colleague asked me if she could tell me a story. She then proceeded to describe the following series of very historical events. A few years before our conversation, she had sent her 4-year-old son up to a petting zoo north of the city with their nanny. At 10:06 a.m., very precise time, she got a sudden flash of a picture in her head of her son screaming in his car seat in the back of the car, and the car filling up with what looked like white smoke, which she did not understand. She knew it was a serious car crash, as she could also feel the impact in her body viscerally. So there was a physical sensation of an impact as well. This woman immediately did what every mother would do in this situation. She called the nanny. They were already in the petting zoo. The mother instructed the nanny to come home immediately and to drive very slowly on side roads, which is what they did, and they got home fine. The next day, the boy wanted to go back to the petting zoo. He had, after all, not been allowed to stay at the zoo that day before. His mother had ruined that. So the mother decided to drive him up herself this time to take no chances. On the way there, a car made a sharp turn in front of them on the highway, and a serious car crash ensued. The son was screaming in the back car seat when the car stopped. The airbags had deployed and filled the car up with white powder, or what she had seen as smoke. So now she knew why the smoke was white. The mother turned around to check on her son. This is when the flash from the day before replayed like a precise video rerun, as she put it. The man who hit them offered to call the woman's husband after the crash, since the woman could not get to her phone and was herself injured. The emergency call registered on her husband's phone at 10:08 a.m. So is this a mental or a material event? It is both, of course, but what does that mean? The conventional scientists committed to some form of materialism or physicalism will try to claim that the story did not happen, or that it is nothing more than a series of coincidences. But is that really convincing? It is rather pathetic response, to be honest. A flimsy piece of rhetoric that people believe because it confirms what they already believe. And yes, they believe materialism and one-way physical causality. Clearly something else is happening here, and it has something to do with the imagination, with the movie going off in the mother's head, with what was shown to her. She misinterprets the visionary display. She thinks it is happening at that moment, and so she helps cause the future accident the next day. She would not have been driving then and there had she not ruined the boy's visit on the previous day. But the vision was trying to talk to her and probably warn her. Maybe it wanted to be misinterpreted as a clairvoyant cognition instead of a precognitive one. The woman was no doubt more careful the next day because of the previous day's vision. Perhaps the vision wished to turn what could have been a deadly car accident into a very, very bad day and a set of addressable injuries. But from where or when did this agency act? Did the present mother unconsciously contact her future self? Or did the future mother contact her past self through the vision? Please also note that the vision was not metaphorical at all. It was a quite literal replaying of a sensory experience. Okay, this is my conclusion. It's quick. Ultimately, I think the imagination is another word for consciousness, which stories like this one suggest is not entirely bound to space and time. Certainly, we cannot fully theorize something like consciousness, and for a very simple reason. We are it. The I cannot I itself. But such an I can, if comparative mystical literature means what I think it means, come to know itself as so. As the famous line from the medieval German Christian professor had it, the eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. The eye of consciousness, the eye of God, can also come to appreciate the movies it throws up on its own historical and cultural screens, special effects and all. It can believe them, even become them. But the same consciousness also knows that it is not ultimately those movies, however convincing they may seem at times, and so it can disbelieve them. Both responses, belief and unbelief, are perfectly understandable. Both are simply so, but in a very different state of consciousness and rationality. The human, as I like to say, is two. That's a lot, I admit. Still, it's my best shot. To sum up, what I think these archives of the impossible are all finally about is collecting and admitting as many dots as we can, and then seeing how we might connect them to form new pictures of ourselves on our mental and cultural screens. The challenge, of course, is that we ourselves are dots in the pictures we are trying to see. Characters in the stories we may no longer believe. But this itself is the beginning of an awakening. This itself is an early, if always incomplete, realization of who and what we are. Thank you very much.